deeply concerned about the downtrodden 1%. By Jim Watson, FPGT Images. At present, the Republican dream of passing a tax reform bill by the end of the year is held together by two paper clips, a stale piece of gum, and the vintage Ronald Reagan cufflinks that Paul Ryan scored on eBay, which he rubs every morning to give him strength. Democrats don't want to touch the House or Senate bills with a 200-foot pole. Republicans in blue states are all riled up about the call to end state and local deductions. Virtually everyone has concluded that both chambers' plans will blow a huge hole in the deficit, precluding the House from making the claim that its tax cuts will pay for themselves and the Senate from passing a bill through reconciliation. The rush to push legislation through on a ridiculously tight, self-imposed timeline is alarming tax specialists who warn that new and unforeseen complexity, loopholes, and glitches could come back to haunt tax collectors and taxpayers. So naturally, President Donald Trump has chosen to weigh in with a few unpopular, last-minute suggestions. On Monday, the president took time out of confounding Asian diplomats to tweet, "I am proud of the Rep. House Senate for working so hard on cutting taxes and reform. We're getting close now. How about ending the unfair, highly unpopular INDIV mandate and no-care, reducing taxes even further, cut top rate to 35% while of the rest going to middle-income cuts? That's a hell of a wrench to throw into the GOP plan, given how troubled it already is." To clarify, Trump is suggesting using tax reform to simultaneously repeal the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate, which would employ the savings derived from 15 million Americans going uninsured to cut income taxes on the ultra-rich. That's remarkable not only because Republicans already tried and failed to mess with Obamacare, but it's the call for a further rate cut that's truly incredible, and asking for the top tax rate to come down to 35%. It's currently at 39.6%, with the House plan keeping it there and the Senate plan bringing it down to 38.5%. The president indicated that lawmakers' current proposals don't cut taxes enough for the wealthiest people in the country. Congress, luckily, is already well-trained to ignore the president. Still, Trump's 11th hour tweet doesn't make things easier for Republican leaders, who have been doggedly insisting that their legislation is, first and foremost, about the middle class. The math doesn't really support that contention, which is why Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, having already flunked the math portion of tax reform, are now scrambling to find any voodoo economist willing to explain away the massive deficit hole in their plan. In which case, what's another 3.5-point cut among friends? If you would like to receive the Levin Report in your inbox daily, click here to subscribe. Janet Yellen shades Trump on the way out. Earlier this month, Trump nominated Jerome Powell to lead the Federal Reserve when Janet Yellen's term expires in February, breaking a tradition in which every Fed chair in modern history has been nominated for a second term because he is intent on making his mark. And while Yellen isn't the type to start flame wars, Business Insider notes that in a speech last week praising the late Senator Paul H. Douglas, she seemed to continue her tradition of subtly critiquing the boss without actually mentioning his name. Some of her more pointed lines include, in 1939, Paul Douglas was one of the first public officials in America to publish a full accounting of his personal finances after he was elected to the Senate. Douglas was a champion of consumer protection laws, and one of Paul Douglas' most important achievements in public life was to promote ethics in government. Or maybe it's just a total coincidence that, unlike Douglas, Trump has refused to reveal his tax returns, dispatched his vice president to overturn a rule that would allow consumers to file class action lawsuits against banks and credit unions, and is on track to go down as having more conflicts of interest than all previous presidents combined. Being nicer to banks is the first thing on my to-do list. Trump regulator changing the tenor of supervision will probably actually be the biggest part of what it is that I do, Federal Reserve Regulatory Chief Randall Quarles told bankers in his first public remarks last week. A day later, Keith Noreika, the acting controller of the currency whom the White House used a brazen backdoor move to install in May, criticized Obama-era officials for holding banks to lofty standards. "My kid, if I told her that she had to study for her science test, but she always failed, I don't think she would study for her science test. The same goes for a bank. You want to incentivize them," he explained. Noreika's banks are people. Two remarks follow those of Commodity Futures Trading Commission Chief James McDonald, who in September announced that his agency would increasingly look to banks and other financial institutions to come clean on their own about misconduct and problems in the market. By a strange coincidence, the monetary penalties imposed by the three main groups that police Wall Street have declined sharply in the first half of the year versus similar stretches in previous times. Bonus watch 17 gutting financial regulation pays off. Consider investing in that six-figure Italian sports car whose sticker price is inversely correlated to the size of your Salvatore Ferragamo's today per Reuters. Bankers who advise companies on issuing stock or bonds could see an even bigger pay jump, as much as 20%, compensation firm Johnson Associates Inc. said on Sunday. A reduced emphasis on financial regulation under U.S. President Donald Trump has boosted shares of banks to peak levels on hopes higher interest rates, lower taxes, and faster economic growth under the Trump administration would lift profits. Elsewhere, a Treasury Secretary says tax bill on track for completion next month. WSJ JP Morgan says family awarded $8 billion deserves nothing. Bloomberg Bitcoin plunge exposes a fundamental flaw. Bloomberg Silicon Valley sets sights on disrupting meat industry. Financial Times Goldman's dealmakers pack suitcases to chase down smaller game. Bloomberg how the tax scams of the super rich screw the poor. The Hive Venezuela's 30 minutes of debt talks leave bondholders guessing. Bloomberg shares plunge 7% for biggest decline since housing recession after turnaround plan unveiled. CNBC's new Star Wars game is so unpopular developer is apparently getting death threats. CNBC Tiffany baffles with $9,000 ball of yarn, $1,000 tin can UPI.